Hi everyone, this is Isaac Steincamp from the Chess Summit Network, and I'm getting ready for my Potomac Open tournament tomorrow. I'm really looking forward to that, and then I've got the Washington International week afterwards. So I decided to do a live chess video for today to kind of not only help me prepare, but to help you guys see what it's like when I play a live chess game in a relatively short time control. Um, in terms for me, if you watched my last video, you know I just finished 4 out of 9 at the World Open. I wasn't too happy with the result after having started 4 out of 6 and then finishing the tournament 0 for 3. But I think there's a lot of reasons to be looking forward to this next tournament. I just played a DC Chess League against someone who's a little bit higher rated than me, about 2100, and I was able to get a draw in a game where I wasn't really concerned about losing for the whole duration of the game, which is definitely encouraging. Looking forward to Friday and onwards. So I've got these two tournaments as my last send off before I go to the University of Pittsburgh. So I'm really looking forward to that. And it looks like I've got a tough game here in my live chess video. Probably my toughest opponent I've had in a very long time, if not ever, at the rating of 2060. So my opponent is kind of keeping things coy. I don't really know if he wants to go for an anti-Grinfeld or for a King's Indian, but this move d6 um, is kind of making it look more like a King's Indian. Let's see what kind of move order he uses, and that kind of dictate what kind of plan I'll use. After move knight c3, I have a couple different approaches of how I can place my pawns, but he actually decides to go for a symmetrical, which is also totally a viable system. So here I'm going to kind of switch gears, and instead of playing for my knight on e2, I'm just going to put my knight on f3, and I'm just going to wait for d4 to happen at the right moment. My opponent is probably going for one of the more aggressive lines. If he plays e5, my goal is to then go ahead and find a way to play for the d5 square. But here my opponent plays e6, which is, I believe, is like a Mark Dvoretsky strategy against a King's Indian setup. But is there maybe a way that I can kind of exploit this play? Is there like a d4 pawn takes knight to b5 ideas, or is e5 too strong? Yeah, I think if d6 weren't there, then maybe I've seen this game before with like Sam Shankland playing black, and there was at least one opportunity to force a 3 move, but definitely want to be pushing for a win. So let's see. My opponent's going to play knight to ge7 at some point, so I think the right idea is to try to stop my opponent from playing d5, because this is probably his best way to be aggressive. So a move like e4 would be helpful. The disadvantage for this move is I do create some dark squared weaknesses for my opponent to kind of use, for example, the d4 square or the e5 square. But for example, knight to d4 isn't so worrisome. After knight d4, knight takes d. However he takes back, I'll probably play the move knight to e2, and I can play for d3, f4, and white's totally fine. But this will probably be a pretty competitive game here. Another strategy for my opponent is to play a move like knight to f6, followed by castles, knight e8, knight c7. But because of the way my opponent decided to set up his position, I think that this is kind of slow, because the move d6 is kind of pointless if he wanted to go for the setup. So he's probably just going to go for knight to e7, castles, and get a very safe position, rook b8, b5 ideas. So I think my opponent's got a very solid position. This should be a fairly fun strategic positional game. So knight to ge7. Let's see here. I could play the move d3, but it might make sense to go ahead and start getting my pieces off the diagonal too. Let's think here. So rook b1, castles a3. I mean, there's so many right moves in these positions. And I'm never worried about bishop takes c3, because that's more of a problem for black than it is for white. After d takes c3, bishop to h6. So this isn't really a problem for me. But rook to b1 probably isn't a bad idea, because it already limits the idea of black's queenside expansion. Because black's, main play is for d5 and for a6 and b5. So this goes ahead and, if I want to at some point play b4, I might have this option. Okay, so my opponent castles here. I'll just play the move d3. I can play the move bishop to e3. I don't have to play h3 because there's no knight to g4, which is definitely a good thing to not have to worry about. But I'm curious to see how my opponent's going to respond. He could play the move e5, but then he should just play e5 beforehand, right? So even though my knight on f3 is not exactly where it wants to be, my opponent either has to waste a tempi here to justify his position, or to just go for the queenside play. And I'm not too convinced that there's anything here just yet. Meanwhile, I can play for like knight e1, f4, or bishop to e3 and knight e1, knight c2. And I'm very solid here in these kinds of positions, so I'm not too worried. And if my opponent ever blocks his bishop from the diagonal, I have d4 at the right moment, and I can kind of break things open in the center. And with a pawn on d6 and having already played e6, that does not favor my opponent because the d6 pawn is a big target on a half-open file, and it's not quite clear if my opponent can set up like a hedgehog style of play in time, especially without having played b6 and bishop b7. Here my opponent could try to play b6 and bishop b7 and try to keep it like a slow play kind of position, but I'm not too convinced by this method. For one, I can just continue my plan of like bishop to e3, queen d2, rook f d1, and be totally happy with the kind of position I'm getting. But by having already played rook to b1, I've actually eliminated a lot of my opponent's queen-size ideas. For example, after a6, I have a4, and it's, I could play knight to e1 at some point to play f4, but then that could also set up knight to c2, which could prepare the move b4. Generally, when you play a4, your opponent tries to play a6, b5, and knight d4 to try to set this up, but this knight d4 move might not work as well, because now I'll have the move b4 to insert. So I definitely have a little bit more of a strategic setup, but my opponent's definitely kind of confused as the right way to proceed here. But as you can tell, the problem with Black's position is that he's got the bad c8 bishop, and in order for him to really use that, he'll have to play the move e5 or the move b6. Because of the way my pawns are set out, bishop to a6 doesn't really make sense, and bishop to b7 to prepare d5 is kind of slow. But if he plays the move e5, then not only did he waste a move, but the weakness that I made by opening up the d4 square for my opponent is kind of reciprocated by my opponent weakening the d5 square. That's the advantage of having the pawn on e6. This is very hard for white to get concrete play on the fifth rank, especially in the center. And black usually joins a lot of stability and generally a pretty good center. Black could also try for f5, and this is the one downside to not having my knight on e2. He could play for f5, but it's not so clear how my opponent plans to go from there. So here he plays h6, which I guess communicates he doesn't want this move bishop to g4 or knight to bishop to g5 or knight to h5 to happen. But I'm not exactly sure why. I could theoretically have played bishop to g5, but this dark square to bishop is really important to me because my weaknesses are on dark squares, so it's really important that I have a way to counter. So maybe the move bishop to e3 is maybe the right approach, because then I can kind of play to attack h6, and this would buy me time to help me set up my position the way I want to. So I'm going to play bishop to e3 here. My opponent, doesn't really want to go for d5. But by playing on the wings, he kind of makes it difficult for himself to really expand. I'm going to guess my opponent's going to play for king to h7 and f5. But if he really wanted to do this, I just think that he could have played f5 beforehand. If he plays g5, this is very committal, and I don't really believe in this idea personally. I could just play the move like h4, and I'll be totally fine. So it's hard to say that the opening battle has been won by anybody, but I'm a little bit biased as an English player. I would prefer to be white in this kind of a position. So everything should be good to go. Okay, so here my opponent plays for d4, which is the typical strategy here. I have a couple of approaches. I can just ignore him and play queen to d2 and play around this knight. And in the meantime, while my opponent tries to set up defenses, play moves like knight to e2, knight to e1, f4, and get some reasonable play. A move like queen d2 also helps protect c3, so a move like b4 becomes entirely possible. This is one of the nice things about the English setup. It's very easily to go both ways. So here I'll play the move queen d2. If knight takes f3, just bishop takes f3, and the bishop can go back. And I should be totally fine. My opponent could also play knight on e to c6 at some point, which is something I should watch for. So maybe this b4 plan is actually not that bad of an idea. Because after b4, if he plays knight bc6, I have b5, and then all of a sudden my opponent has a hard time holding the position. So I'll go for this b4 idea. and see what he does. Knight bc6. Okay, so he's very clearly wanting to play for the center, but now I get this move b5. He could play knight to b4, but I still have my a pawn. I can always just play a3, and knight c2 doesn't really scare me. But he might also be trying to play for knight to e5 at some point, with the idea that if I take on e5, even though he doubles the pawns, he can put pressure on the d3 pawn. However, by playing knight to e5, he blocks the d4 square and lets me take the knight without any worries of a serious pin. For example, knight e5, knight takes, pawn takes, bishop takes. Although knight to f3 could have been interesting. We can maybe look over that after the game. Because here I'll play the move bishop takes f3 with the idea of just going back to like g2 afterwards. But I think this exchange helps me because I wanted to play f4, and I would have had to play a move like knight e1 and then knight c2 or something like that to really reactivate my knight, or knight e1 and then knight f3 with f4 in between. But by having this trade, it makes it easier for me to play f4. Yes, my opponent was cramped and he'd like to trade pieces, but in reality, that was one of his better pieces. If I can leave his light squared bishop behind his pawn chain, if it's pair of bishops versus pair of bishops, we should be reasonably fine. I think my plan here is just play f4 followed by knight to e2, trade off on d4, and kind of see what my opponent does. If he has a doubled pawn on d4, it doesn't really create the same advantage as it does in some of the other traditional English positions, just because I'm playing around the center and going for both the king side and the queen side. My opponent might have an interesting shot here with the move queen to a5, with the idea that if I ever do play knight to e2, he can insert queen takes d2, and then after bishop takes d2, knight takes e2 is check, and I lose the game. So this could be an interesting idea, but I will always have time to play a move like rook on f to d1, or I can just ignore it and continue with f4, h3, g4, g5, caveman attack style chess. So I'm feeling fairly confident with how that turned out. And the even harder part for black is, there were some possibilities for him to maybe play a move like d5 and try to play against my d3 pawn. I wasn't totally convinced, but now that's not really a possibility at all. I have 1, 2, 3, 4 defenders of that square. My opponent only will have 2 attackers. And a move like b6 isn't really practical. I might even be able to insert a move like e5 to just go ahead and attack the rook, after which d5, e takes d, knight takes d, or bishop takes d, and I should just be totally fine. So here my opponent plays bishop to d7. So I guess the question for me is, do I want to play f4 here? My opponent's goal is to obviously play a move like a6 and then try to play on the a file. So it might be helpful to go ahead and get a piece out of the way in the center. And even if that means trading off dark squared bishops for his dark squared bishop, that's probably a good trade for me anyways, because I'll eliminate most of his counterplay. His bishop on g7 in these kinds of positions can turn out to be a monster if I'm not careful, especially since he's playing on the queen side. So this definitely wouldn't be too bad. So I'll play a move like knight to e2, and if he doesn't take and just goes back, well, goes back where, obviously, right? But like, let's say this pawn wasn't on b5 and he just went back to c6. Having the knight on e2 isn't that bad, because after f4, g4, I can just play knight to g3. So I'll play this move, knight to e2. I'm okay with knight takes, queen takes, even though that kind of uses up a move for me, because it gets rid of one of his stronger pieces. It wasn't so clear what my knight on c3 was doing, and if anything, it was a target for a tactical shot, being on the long diagonal, only being protected by one piece. So I'm feeling pretty good right now about the way my position is setting up. So I'll probably play a move like f4 first, so that way if I take and he plays pawn takes, I have bishop f2 and bishop e1 and I can reroute my bishop, because if I don't do that, then obviously my bishop's trapped. And the whole point for doubling his pawns is to trap in his bishop, not mine. So, based on how the openings turned out, originally I thought like, okay, maybe I'm slightly better, I have a strategic edge, a minuscule advantage, but now I think I've been able to build up on that advantage, and you can definitely see that, being, with a point value on the clock. Okay, so here my opponent plays e5, which blocks in his bishop, and it opens the d5 square. So I have a couple options. I can play f4 and then try to play f5. I guess my opponent just really wants his bishop to be in the game, and the idea is maybe at some point he can play the move bishop to g4 followed by like a knight f3, and then trade the piece that way. But this is a positional concession, even though it does lock off the position, because I wasn't really giving up anything by letting him play knight to d4. Allowing me to have a knight on d5 at some point might be something to be happy about. Another thing is, maybe do I want to trade off my dark squared bishop on d4? And usually this is a very unorthodox idea in the English. I know Hammer tried it against Vachier Lagrave at Norway Chess 2015. It didn't really turn out so strong. But here, bishop takes d4. I don't really think this makes an exception to the rule. My opponent can break open the position, and I do need to be worried about my dark squares. So this would also not work here. So maybe the idea is to just go ahead and play f4, to which my opponent will probably respond f5, but then I could play e takes f5, and my bishop is wide open, while my opponent's won't be if he plays e takes f4. So I like this move. And if my opponent plays e takes f, I have a couple ways to recapture. It might make sense to play g takes f. But I don't really think I'll get like a traditional attack going. So I might go for bishop takes f, because then I can consider taking on d4 again, but I'm also putting pressure on d6. And it's not so clear how my opponent gets play. Also, at that point, if I play knight takes d and he plays bishop takes d4 check, I can always block with bishop to e3. And I have a slightly better position. I can play against the f7 pawn. I think my opponent can, still have something to play for. But he's definitely not doing himself any favors with time. He might try for a6 at some point. This might be the other move that he tries out. But in reality, I can always just respond to a4. The a file doesn't mean too much for my opponent, especially since he's already locked in his bishop, and I always have the move rook to a1 just in time. a6, a4, a takes b, a takes b. If he tries to double up his rook by playing with like rook a7, I just have rook to a1. Queen to a8 can be, met relatively easily with a move. Well, actually, this is something to consider because a1 square can't really easily be protected with a knight on e2. So, well, at that point, it might make sense to go ahead and start playing like knight c3, knight d5. So like a4, a6, or a6, a4, a takes b, a takes b, rook to a7. It might make sense to just play knight to c3 if queen to a8. Then I have like queen to b2 followed by rook to a1. I didn't even worry about like knight c2 fork ideas though, so this could be an interesting idea. The other thing is after a6 I always do have b6, but this is a pawn weakness. It's very committal. But this might actually make sense because once I play b6, he doesn't have a way to easily get to that pawn. So then I can play knight c3 and then knight d5 and then even knight to c7 in some lines. I don't really think this is too pleasant for my opponent to be, playing against. So I'm not really sure how he's going to improve his position, and he's only got 3.5 minutes. So I'm liking my position a lot here. Rook to b8. So I think his goal is he wants to play f5. And he was afraid of e takes f5. This would be the only way to explain this, because obviously b6 is not a threat here for my opponent. So if I play the move f5, g takes f, e takes f, there's no real sack there. Maybe now is the time to play knight takes d4, because there's really no other way to improve my position. I'm assuming he'd play c takes d. And if I play bishop to f2, not so sure anymore. Let's see. This will be probably my first real think of this game so far. The other option is I could always look for f takes e. I don't really think I have any sort of like kingside attack. But after d takes e, yes, I've opened a half-open file, but I guess the question is, isn't this more helpful for black? Because then my d3 pawn's on a half-open file, my opponent can play f5 and try to bust up my position. And, my g2 bishop isn't the best right now, and it's not so clear how I'm going to make progress. So maybe I would look for a move like rook on b to e1, so after a move like f5, I can take and then have the e file. But But to this, it might be helpful to have a knight on c3, so that way my pieces aren't really like overly attached to one another. Knight to c3, f5, rook on b to e1. And the idea is that I can play e takes f, not necessarily to open up the bishop, but because in that way my knight is a little bit stronger. But my opponent, like, his knight's only annoying because of some of the knight takes e2 deflection ideas at this point. So while it did make sense before to trade, when he played e5, this changed the position. So I think here it makes sense to go ahead and play knight to c3, with the idea of going to e5, d5 or e4 at some point. And I'm reasonably happy with these ideas. The rook doesn't really serve a purpose in b1 anymore, so eventually I'll go to e1, and I should enjoy a good position. So, not too much calculation there, mostly an intuitive move. So hopefully I'll continue to keep my advantage. I don't really see anything for black besides the move f5. I mean, he can make minor moves like b6 first, but then he's just kind of giving me time. His light squared bishop is looking really awful right now, and I'm just not convinced at all with how his play's turning out. So he played f5, kind of like how I expected. But, again, here, he can't really play e takes f4 without creating a weakness on d6. He can't really play f takes e4 without giving my an outpost for my knight. So I'm just going to play the move of rook on b to e1 and kind of see what he does. My rooks are definitely better placed than his. He kind of wasted this move with rook to b8. I didn't really think it was that necessary. He wanted to play f5, but it's still, like, even here, it's not even clear like how he's going to take advantage of this move. Because if anything, it gives me the possibilities to play more effectively on the light squares. Maybe go for like a knight d5 kind of move, or clear the e4 square and put my knight there. Okay, so here my opponent is trying to get tricky with the move queen to a5, but it's hard to believe that an endgame would be that much better for him either. After a move like knight to d5, queen takes d2, bishop takes d2, all of my pawns are protected, and I'm doing reasonably okay. His knight doesn't really have any sneaky moves there, so I don't really see anything wrong with the move knight d5. Is there maybe a move I would like to insert beforehand is the question. I'm not really seeing anything that's any more favorable than just trading upright, so I'll just play this move knight to d5. My opponent's probably going to trade queens. That's the whole point for this move. Here we go. Bishop takes d2, and again, we're seeing that his d4 knight can't really do that much as long as my pawn's on a2, stopping him from entering in on b3. If he goes knight to c2, okay, I'll play rook to c1. Yes, my rook is no longer on e1, but his knight's no longer on d4. He goes back to d4, okay, so what? No harm done. So my opponent's got a lot to consider. He's got the weaker pieces right now. It's not so clear how to progress. Well, here it definitely makes sense to open up the diagonal with a move like e takes f, because now I can start to play on the light squares, and this is starting to look like a favorable break for me. If he plays a move like bishop takes f5, I probably should have looked at this a little bit more. I could play bishop to e4 for starters, so it's not a bad move, but a move like rook e3 would be met by knight c2. So this is a move I probably should have spent a little bit more time thinking on, but I can just play bishop e4. I'm not happy about that, because his bishop was bad before. Can I play knight c7? No, not really, because then he plays rook to e7, knight d5, rook f7. Yeah, so here I have to make this concession. I'm not happy about that. Yeah, I definitely should have spent more time on this move. So maybe e takes f, rook takes f. I mean, I should still be slightly better. My knight does more than his knight does. I do need to watch out for knight f3 moves, though. And that's probably the thing that makes me a little bit more upset than anything else. Okay, so rook takes f4, bishop takes, rook takes e4. Okay, well, I can always look into bishop takes f4 ideas, because the d6 pawn is a very weak pawn, and it's not the end of the world if after bishop takes e4, if I have an isolated pawn, because his pawn's very weak, and he probably has to play like bishop to e5 to try to cover it, and at that point we'll have a symmetrical pawn structure. So is bishop takes f5 an option? Not as much. Okay, so here I'll just play bishop takes f4. Probably equal chances. I think in the most critical moment of the game, when I took on f5, kind of relieved the tension, I think that favored black a little bit more. I don't think black is better. I just think black is closer to equality than he was, a couple moves ago, and now I'm definitely paying the price for it. So he plays bishop to h3. I'm not exactly sure what the threat is here. He doesn't exactly have a fork threatened, and at the same time, he's kind of letting me keep my light squared bishop, but his light squared bishop's actually annoying too. So maybe a move like bishop to g2 might be helpful, because in that way, well, he would have the move knight to e2 check, king to h1. Well, there's no clear continuation here. Bishop takes d6. Does this move make sense? Bishop takes f1, bishop takes f8, rook takes f8, rook takes f1. I'm up a pawn and an opposite colored bishop ending. But after b6, I can start to look for some weaknesses. Bishop takes d6, rook takes f1, rook takes f1, bishop takes f1. Now my opponent's actually better, so this line wouldn't work. So maybe I have to play rook f2 first. I really want to be able to force an attacking line on d6 where my opponent has to create weaknesses. So maybe bishop g2 makes more sense. Bishop g2, bishop takes g2, king takes g2. And now, if knight to f2, knight to e2, well, knight to e2 would let him trade off the knight for the bishop, and that might even help black. So rook f2 is looking like a forced move, but then when I play bishop to g2, the e2 square is covered, as long as my rook on e1 doesn't hang. This position is deep. Okay. Rook f2. I'd probably just have to get my rook off the e-file, but my opponent can't really move his rook from f8 either, because bishop takes g6 is a possibility in some lines. So okay, I have to play rook to f2. Yeah, I really underestimated how much e takes f5 would have changed the position. We'll have to look at that move afterwards. I still think with the time advantage that I've got and the fact that d6 is still a weakness, I should be able to have something to play for. But it's not so clear. But my opponent does have to deal with this bishop takes d6 threat, and if he... What is going on? Okay, I have to look at this move. I don't believe that this is really a threat. I guess my opponent's idea is that once he moves a knight from d4, he can play bishop to d4, so he'd play like knight f3 or something. This does not make sense. Rook takes e4, knight to e2, rook takes e2, knight to f3, rook takes f3. There's no checkmate. If he plays a move like g5, I can just take on d6. I'm going to take this rook. Okay. If I take on d6, he has the move knight to f3, which I have to take back. Okay. But with knight f3, I can always move my king too. I don't actually have to take his knight. I can play king to h1. That's not checkmate. And then his pieces start to get tangled. So I'm pretty sure that I'm doing fine. After knight f3, just king to h1. How are you protecting that knight, good sir? Okay, I will offer a rook trade. If he trades the rook, the game's essentially over. Oh wow, he goes for it. But there's no mate threat. What pieces better take with? I think it doesn't matter. I'll take with bishop, keeping the threat of c5. Okay, I'll cover my dark squares here. I'll put my bishop on e3 when he plays b6. I have to be careful to not get checkmated here, but my opponent doesn't really have threats. When you don't really have threats, it's really hard to play for a win. Okay, I'm planning to move knight to f4, covering my squares, covering g2, attacking h3. My opponent's bishop is essentially useless, and will he run out of time? That answer is correct. And that is probably the highest rated person I've beaten on g15 in a very long time on chess.com. Not chess.com, ICC. This is exciting for me. I'm one step closer to 2000. Let's take a look at that game. I think that there's a lot of things that we can enjoy from that game from both sides. So let's go to history and go to my game. So here I had the white pieces. I wasn't really sure what to expect when my opponent just went out with g6. And this is one of the good things about being flexible, especially with the black pieces against the English. He did a really nice job of kind of keeping his options open. Ultimately decided to go for a symmetrical English line where he probably had the most chances. Traditionally here after castles, white is expecting the move e5, to which knight e1, knight c2, knight e3 to play for the d5 squares. It's kind of like the main line. But I was really surprised here to see this move e6. I see this system a lot with players playing the English with the white pieces, but it just felt slow and too methodical as black to really be able to do too much. But this shouldn't be a wrong move. I played the move e4, stopping him from ever trying to really break forward with d5. The problem with this move, though, is that in these kind of structures, the knight is more flexible on e2 because then both d4 and f4 are possible. And I had the dilemma that my knight being on f3 kind of slowed me down and made it more difficult to play. So my opponent kept on playing knight e7, rook b1. I wasn't really sure exactly what the best move to make here was. I just felt like there was a lot of good ideas. But rook b1 is a general prophylactic move, getting off the diagonal, but also planning to break open on the queen side if my opponent chooses to go down the a6 b5 route, because I would play a move like a4, and once my opponent plays knight to d4, I have b4 myself, and I'm totally fine. My opponent castled. I played d3. And h6, I think, was the first real mistake for my opponent. This is a very classical move for a lot of English players. And the idea is to stop a piece from getting to g5. But, unlike other positions where it might make sense for me to play bishop g5 and force him to play f6 or then take on e7, I really need my dark squared bishop to cover both the d4 and the e5 squares. And it became an important player throughout the game, as we saw. So I really thought that h6 kind of slowed things down, and it justified this move b4 once he played the move knight to d4. So bishop to e3, knight d4, and here I had a chance to become more flexible. And I think my opponent jumped on this square too soon. I think he really needed to play a move like a5 first, stop the idea of b4, or he needed to play king h7 first. But by playing h6, he created problems that he might not have been expecting. Queen d2, king to h7, and then I played the move b4 with the idea that if c takes b, I have the central advantage, and while my pieces aren't in the most orthodox structure, my opponent's grip on the d4 square is a little bit more problematic. So my opponent handled the situation probably the best way, knight on e to c6, and after b5, trading once and then putting another knight in the center. Notice how I didn't play b takes c5. For me, it's bad if I create a half-open file in d-file right now with my pawn on d3, because by doing that, what that means is that my opponent can play to put pieces on the file, rooks, queens, whatever it be, and just attack the d3 square. So by keeping the position close, I gave myself the most amount of chances. So I played bishop to g2, felt like the most natural move there. He played bishop to d7, and he's kind of just buying time, just improving the position. Here I went for the trade, and when my opponent played e5, I thought that this was kind of a suspicious moment because it really opened up the d5 square for my knight, and I thought that that gave me a lot more chances. But before I did that, I played f4, tried to expand a little bit, and my opponent played rook b8. I knew immediately that he wanted to play f5 because if e takes f5, then bishop takes b7 would have been a problem, and with my already pushed pawns on the queen side, I'm probably winning this game 9 times out of 10. So I played the move knight to c3. And my goal was, I realized that I needed my knight off of the e2 square because knight takes e2, queen takes e2 kind of put my queen on a square where it no longer needed to be. So by playing knight to c3, I allowed for knight to d4 to be an idea that I had, but also at the same time, I let myself be more flexible in the e-file with my rook. So f5, rook on b to e1, queen to a5, knight d5. I liked the idea of going into an endgame because my opponent was cramped. Queen takes, bishop takes, rook e8, and I think this was the mistake right here. So let's see, maybe there's a better opportunity for me here because I really underestimated the pressure that my opponent could put on d3 for a move to then put his pieces on better squares. It may not have been too bad in reality, but maybe the thing to do was to really calculate if I needed to trade this bishop for this knight. And I know I had the opportunity earlier, but it just didn't make sense. But we're out of the opening now, and my opponent can't really attack me anymore. So maybe it might have made sense to create a half-open file on the E or on the C file, and then play to push one of the pawns on that side. That might have been strategy number 1. Strategy number 2, if there is one, let's see. I wasn't too crazy about f takes e5 because it let my opponent create pressure on the e file. So I really think if I take one of the central pawns, I'm falling behind. So maybe instead of being greedy and trying to go for this long diagonal, a sneakier move would have been bishop to h3, with the idea being that my opponent can't play f takes e4 without allowing for bishop takes e4 to happen, bishop takes d7 rather to happen. So he'd have to play a move like bishop to c8, and then maybe, just maybe, I can slowly build from that position. But e takes f5 while I let my opponent into the game. It wasn't the end of the world. Here I had to offer the trade of bishops. I think my opponent should have taken it, but he was already in time trouble. He took on f4, which allowed me to put pressure on d6. And then after bishop h3, rook f2, I don't think this exchange stack works, but as you can see on the clock, my opponent only had 21 seconds left. Kudos to him. He played a really tough game. But I don't really know what he could have done. I think the best thing for him is to just sit or find a way to deal with this threat of bishop takes g6 check at some point, because he can't use this rook until he deals with this discovery. Maybe another idea was to look for a move like bishop to e5 or bishop to f5. I think if he plays bishop to f5, well, he does actually have to deal with the d6 pawn, but maybe an eventual plan of bishop to f5. It just felt like in the game this bishop on h3 didn't really do too much. Rook f2, he took. I didn't see anything, so I took. And he played g5, and I think what he miscalculated was this isn't checkmate, because after king h1, I don't have to sack back the exchange. In this position, I think if I do have to play rook takes f3, after rook takes f3, I am in a little bit of trouble. Bishop to d4 is coming, rook f1 checkmate is coming, but because of king to h1, he doesn't really get that opportunity to open the file. He played rook to f7, not really many options here, and I just simplified the position. And when my opponent tried to protect everything, it just became easier for me to use my pieces. So this was a 33-move game, but a really exciting G15 matchup where I got a good position against a much higher-rated opponent on ICC. And hopefully this is a good sign for me going into the Potomac Open this weekend. This is Isaac Steincamp signing off from the Chess Summit Network. I hope you enjoyed this edition of Live Chess. I certainly did. It's definitely one of my most exciting games here on the web. And I hope to be making many more videos like this in the near future. Thank you very much, and I'll see you next time. Bye.